Well, hello, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you to our fifth E4 Brown Bag that we've been having over the 23-24 school year. I'm Paul Gorin. I'm the director of the E4 Center, and it's great to have you here, whether you're joining us live or watching the recording. Today, we're continuing a series of discussions involving colleagues from the E4 Center, the School of Education and Social Policy here at Northwestern, Curriculum Associates, and our district partners. This initiative actually originated from our E4 convening last May, where we formed a learning community with members from the Chicago Public Schools, the Oakland Unified School District, and several other school districts. The key takeaway from those sessions was a unanimous desire to do more to create and sustain our learning community over time. So this year, with our Brown Bag series, we are extending beyond our in-person events and fostering an ongoing learning community through virtual Brown Bag sessions on a range of topics similar to what we're doing today. For today's talk, I'm really excited to welcome my friend, Dr. Onnie Rogers. Onnie is a developmental psychologist and identity scholar whose research curiosities converge at the intersection of human development, diversity and equity, and education. She explores how social groups and the cultural stereotypes that accompany them shape how we see ourselves and interact with others. Her particular focus is on social identity formation among racially diverse youth in urban contexts. Here at Northwestern, Dr. Rogers is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology and in the School of Education and Social Policy, and is the principal investigator of the DICE lab. Onnie, take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone, or morning-ish if we have some folks on the West Coast. It's really nice to be here and happy to chat with you today. Of course, the downside of the virtual space is that I can't see anyone while I'm presenting, but hopefully I get through this quickly enough and I can stop sharing and we can have a little more conversation. So as Paul said, I am a developmental psychologist, and I like to sort of begin by centering kind of how I came to this work and how I ended up in psychology. I had always planned to be an elementary school teacher, and that was sort of my life goal from the time I was a child. And so I stumbled my way into psychology as an undergraduate. And I was a first generation college student. I was a student athlete, and so I had a scholarship to go to school, and I never thought to ask what sort of majors might be available. And in my first year, I discovered that majoring in education was not going to be an option at UCLA, and so I ended up majoring in psychology, minoring in education. And over those 4 years, psychology sort of took root, if you will. And I really became interested in questions about youth identity development in the context of schools and education. And over the years, that's broadened a bit to think about context more broadly, which is what I'll be talking a bit about today. But for the last almost 2 decades, I've been really interested in questions about the self and how young people understand who they are, discover who they are, imagine who they can become, and really form their identities throughout childhood and adolescence. And that is the focus of my research team, the DICE lab, as we like to call it, where we look at identity development. And in particular, we're interested in the ways that young people resist stereotypes and injustices in society. So I'm going to talk a little bit about context and how that shapes kids' development. And one of the findings from our work in listening to young people is the ways they challenge and question and often disrupt societal stereotypes and injustices, and what that can reveal to us about not just young people, but about our society. And so at the core of this work, with this awesome team of students that you see here that are in the DICE lab with me, we really kind of center on questions about human thriving. Like, what is it that allows people to thrive? How do humans cultivate their social, intellectual, emotional competencies? And that question of thriving really derives from thinking about the fact that society was not designed for everyone to thrive, right? The starting point in the United States, which is where we situate our work, is that certain humans have access to resources that allow them to thrive, and others are positioned to really suffer. And that's America's history, past and present, and we see it manifested in many forms, from colonialism and the violent theft of indigenous peoples and lands and communities, chattel slavery, structural racism, white supremacy, the retelling of our history, the way we reconstruct the January 6th insurrection, right? Healthcare access, Black Lives Matter. We could go on and on. We see the ways inequities and injustices are part of the everyday. And so the question is, how do young people thrive here? Right? If we take seriously the way society was designed intentionally for inequality and the many ways and forms in which those inequities and injustices persist in the form of racism, patriarchy, sexism, homophobia, white supremacy, this inequitable distribution of health and wealth and resource, this societal structure is not fertile ground for thriving. And that's especially true if you are Black, brown, or in a marginalized position. And so this question of how do young people thrive here? How do they cultivate identities that are positive and affirming? How do they build relationships and continue to create and innovate and impact the world around them when a structure is so clearly set to prevent that? And we know that they do resist and persist and thrive. And I know that from my own work, but we also see it, if we open our eyes and look around. But I've been doing research, as I said, for almost 2 decades with young people, and most of that has been interview-based research. So we sit down with young people, usually one-on-one, sometimes in small groups, and we have a conversation about who they are, how they see the world, how they see themselves, what they want to be, who they want to become. And in listening to those stories, what we've learned, particularly from kids of color, Black youth, Latinx youth, multiracial youth, we also interview and talk with white youth. And what we hear is the way structure of oppression and privilege, opportunity and equity are intimately connected into the ways they're understanding who they are, right? Their own identities, their own stories about the self are really in conversation with these toxic systems of injustice. And so learning from young people, I feel like most of my work in some ways has shifted from thinking about what I learn about young people themselves and more about what young people reveal about us as a society. And so the way their identity stories and their experiences shine a light on the sort of societal structures and values that we have put forth in this societal structure. It's embedded in our education systems, it's embedded in healthcare, it's embedded in so many of our social systems. And we hear that in the ways young people are trying to make sense of their own identities. And so the starting point or assumption in some ways that I approach in this work is that we don't really need to fix young people. We do need to fix the cultural context, the norms, the systems, the beliefs, the ideologies that structure the context in which young people develop. So let's talk a little bit about context. I'm sure this basic idea of context matters is something that is not new and something we're all familiar with. And this particular image, even folks may be a bit familiar with. Yuri Bronfenbrenner, as a developmental psychologist, put forth this bioecological system. There's lots of iterations of sort of what this model looks like. But the premise is that young people, children across the life course, develop within context. The child you see is centered, the individual at the center of this image, and then the people and places that surround the child are ordered, if you will, from the most proximal, those things that are immediate in their environment, so parents and schools, to the more macro or distal. And so this has been an important framework in developmental psych, and it's been adapted into lots of different social sciences and other folks who have, sort of thought about development within context. But one of the limitations I want to point out of this framework, especially from the developmental psych world, which is where I sit, is the way that the proximal is privileged over the distal. So even just visually, the fact that the proximal is most immediate to the individual, there's a way in which our attention is focused on those micro processes, parent-child interactions, teacher-student interactions, And these are often privileged or given more time and investment in a way than the macro structures, which are viewed as more distal. So then that means we sort of target individual factors such as motivation or persistence or parent engagement, risky health behaviors, emotion regulation. All of those things are important, of course. But there's a way in which we target those at the expense of the more distal or macro systems that fuel those microprocesses, right? And so when we think about the macro as distal, there's a way in which we see it as kind of background noise. And one of the things that I try to do in this work, which is more sociological, I've been told for sure, is to center the macro system and think about how and why that matters as a central starting point for the way we think about human development and kids' experiences. And so why does the macro context matter? I've been hitting on it already: structural inequality, racism, the role of political power rather than neutrality. And so the idea is that these different contexts that young people are living in are not neutral, and they're not benign, right? There is, as I said before, an intentional and designed inequity that's built into the economic system, that's built into the way schools are funded, for example. So it's not just low-income schools and higher-income schools. There's a whole ideology and set of beliefs that sort of reinforce who gets funds, who is valued, who is given the attention, right? And who is not. And when we remove that structural reality, then we sort of get into conversations about differences where micro level processes, such as individual behaviors, kind of become stand-ins for what I consider macro level problems, right? And so by kind of flipping the script and trying to center the macro and acknowledge the way these systems of racism and beliefs and ideologies, stereotypes, and injustices are not far away, but instead are very proximal to kids' developmental experiences and embedded within these micro contexts and processes that we're studying, I found really shifts the conversation, helps us think differently, not only about why we see certain outcomes and behaviors, but also what it takes to disrupt them, right? What it takes to sort of reimagine different kinds of contexts and spaces for young people. So given that sort of big picture about context, I'm often asking questions about kids' identities, right? I'm saying, okay, so how do kids see themselves within this structure and system? So what is identity? We could do an entire course on identity itself. So I'm going to be very brief here, but there's lots of different ways to conceptualize, think about identity. But at the core, it's sort of this question of who am I? A lot of the research sort of thinks about feelings, beliefs, the thoughts we have about the self as being core to what constitutes identity. The other way that I think about it, drawing from a number of scholars in the field as well, where we think about identity as the stories that we tell. So the way we construct who we are through the narratives we tell about ourselves, about where we've been, about where we're going, and sort of explaining and articulating who we are. And those stories carry lots of power. So that idea of narrative being really focal to identity development. And we care about identity because we know it motivates behavior, it guides action, it sort of directs our attention, right? Things that are focal to our identity are part of how we see ourselves, become aligned with how we behave in the world, the sort of things we value, etc. There's lots of research around identity-based motivation and how that connects to action, as well as it being an important predictor, if you will, or sort of factor that influences a lot of the outcomes that we care about, particularly for young people. So social, emotional well-being, academic engagement, persistence, those sorts of things. And so while this question is about the I and the self, we're going to go back to thinking about the context, and really thinking about identity, not as an isolated process that happens within individuals, but a social and cultural one that operates within and in relationship to these macro systems, macro beliefs and ideologies. Okay. And so this sort of intersection, I think, of the macro and micro is what I find most fascinating about identity, because identity is both something that's very subjective, something that we construct and make meaning of for ourselves at the more micro level, but it's also very macro. It's tied to these social hierarchies, these inequities, the isms of every sort. And we're sort of in relationship with those macro systems as we're constructing our identity. And so our identities are very much about how we see ourselves, but also very much about how we see others and how we are in relationship with our cultural context and society more broadly. And so the idea of sort of taking identity as this lever through which we can understand young people's lived experiences as an important developmental capacity and foundation, but also as a window into how they're navigating society and seeing the way society works. And so my research on identity really thinks about how these structures create harm, but also the way, as I mentioned before, young people resist and it creates possibilities. And one of the ways that I do this is drawing from the lessons of Black women and Black feminists. I have quoted here Kimberly Crenshaw and Bell Hooks, who both underscore the value of listening to and learning from the margins, learning from those who are most marginalized or ignored or sidelined in this societal structure. And that has been very true in our research as well. So Kimberly Crenshaw, this quote is talking about specifically the experiences of Black girls in schools. And she's arguing that the way forward is to listen and incorporate the voices of those who have been silenced. And what I love about the Bell Hooks quote here is where she's writing about the margins and the importance of resistance. And she underscores this point that the margin is much more than a site of deprivation. It is also the site of radical possibility, a space of resistance. And so we're going to be thinking about Black girls specifically and some of the work we've been doing with Black girls. But I want us to also recognize this is 100% about Black girls and based on Black girls' experiences, but it's also about all of us. Right. And so what do we learn about what it means to be human? What do we learn about what it means to support kids' development? What do we learn about education from listening to and centering the voices and perspectives of Black girls? Okay, so why focus on Black girls? There's lots of reasons, but one is that schools are too often spaces where too many Black girls experience a lot of harm and exclusion rather than care and belonging. And there's lots of evidence of this. There's lots of ways in which it operates. And so one of those is adultification. So Black girls are adultified. So from the time they hit those early tween years, they're seen as significantly older than their white counterparts. And that sets the groundwork for a set of beliefs around what Black girls need as part of their human development, so that it's associated with this idea that Black girls don't need as much care and nurturing, that Black girls are more independent, that Black girls actually are more aware of the world, sexually promiscuous, sexually knowledgeable, right? So these sort of the beliefs about what Black girls know and how they experience the world, because we don't even see them as childlike as their peers. Black girls are hypersexualized, they're over-disciplined, they're criminalized. This is happening within the school space, right? And so this manifests in lots of ways, one of the prime being through discipline and sexual harassment. So we know that Black girls are significantly more likely to face discipline than white girls. They encounter sexual harassment at school at very high rates. And the specificity of Black girls' experiences, where they encounter discrimination, discipline on the basis of their hair texture or their dress code, how they appear in their bodies. And so there's a way in which the macro stories about racism and sexism that position Black girls as a particular, in a particular way, manifest in schools, and that gets exemplified in the way that they experience school. And certainly that's not all girls in all spaces at all times, but statistically, we know these patterns are very clear and evident. And so the idea of sort of listening to those who are most marginalized and most impacted by our systems in order to reveal how those systems operate, as well as how to disrupt them. And that was really a driving force for some of our work that has been focused on Black girls. So in 2017, we launched a study that we called Black Girl Magic that was really trying to think about what's happening. Well, what can we learn about Black girls' experiences? Black girls are underrepresented in our research, particularly research that centers their voices. There was a recent study in developmental research that found that Black girls were represented less than 1% of the published articles in our top developmental journals. So most studies just don't even include Black girls. So part of it was just like, let's focus on Black girls' experiences. The other was to really think about, what do we learn about Black girls in spaces, in schools that are designed to pull them in, that are built for them in some way, right? So if we think about the general trend of how Black girls experience school, we know that those are spaces, as Monique Morris writes about, that push them out, right? So this idea of push out from school to prison and criminalization, this push out effect has been well documented. And so part of the question in this work was, well, what's happening in spaces that are trying to pull Black girls in, spaces that are for Black girls? And so this work was at an all Black girls school, an all girls school serving Black girls, as well as an after school program that was for Black girls. And we focused using multiple methods on girls' stories. What is their experience of identity, of relationships, their social and academic development over the course of 3 years. And this work was done in Chicago as well as St. Louis. And one of the focal questions we asked, which I'm going to share about today, was thinking about what Black girl space is and what it means. And so in this sort of effort to, again, sort of flip the script, so to ask, like, what's happening in spaces that are for Black girls? What else do we learn about Black girls' development? We also began to ask, what is Black girl space itself? And how do we conceptualize it, and what can we learn from it? So in our work, we've conceptualized Black girl space as counter space, right? So space that exists, that is just and humane, and exists to serve Black girls, and disrupts sort of the normative way in which Black girls are perceived and seen, right? So it gives us an alternative lens through which to experience Black girls, to hear their experiences. One of the challenges is when the dominant way in which Black girls experience school is through harm and exclusion. There's a way that becomes then the narrative of Black girls' experiences, which also underrepresents the complexity of their lives. And so if we shift the context and the setting, what else do we learn about what's possible for Black girls when we're centering our learning from a set of girls who are in spaces that are meant to pull them in and support them? And so these sorts of Black girl spaces, we found, simultaneously sort of hold the reality of oppression and make that very visible, but also their resistance and sort of the ways that they challenge and question and disrupt. And so given what I shared before, the very limited work on Black girls as centered in our developmental work and literature, I just wanted to share a few of the articles that we've published over the last couple of years from this research, with Black girls, where we've been listening and learning to what are their identity experiences? What do they know about themselves in the world? How are they moving through these spaces? And so looking at the role of colorism, the role of hair, how social media and Black girl magic, how they understand that. And then this piece specifically around Black girl space. And so in doing this work over the past few years, I also got connected with a community partner, Gloria Dotson-Lewis, and we began working together around this question of what does it look like to build Black girl space? Black girl space is something that we learned from Black girls is valuable to them. It's a space where they feel seen and heard. How do we cultivate those kinds of spaces in schools for Black girls? And so for the past few years, we've been engaging this question. What does it look like to build just and humane spaces where girls are seen and valued? And particularly, we've been focused on doing that within school settings, right? The spaces where girls are. So there are after school programs or off, community-based programs. And we've been thinking, what does it mean for girls, Black girls, to have to leave school to find space where they're seen versus having spaces on their school campuses where they're prioritized. So we've been thinking about building such space within school settings. And this has involved a lot of time and creativity and learning along the way. But sort of our primary pillars here is, community partnership and collaboration. We had a diverse community advisory board who's been working with us that includes educators and principals and teachers, psychologists, Black girls, college students, teenagers, and then working collaboratively to develop a space and a set of programming and curriculum that really centers Black girls' experiences and cultivates what we have been hearing from girls in these other spaces constitutes this sort of Black girl space. And so this is the Teen Tea program, as we call it. So this is my collaborator, Gloria Dotson-Lewis. She is a social worker and director of a nonprofit here in Chicago called Distinctively Me, that focuses on social emotional programming for Black girls, ages 12 to 18. And so we've been collaborating for 4 years now around this curriculum, the Talk, Educate, Experience program for Black girls, which is really premised on building brave and safe space to cultivate healthy relationships with ourselves and with each other. That's sort of the mantra, if you will, that we communicate with the girls. The curriculum was designed by our community advisory board, and Gloria and I, and all Black women and girls, including middle school girls who've been part of the developmental process. The curriculum itself is 10 weeks, and we meet 75 minutes each week. And we cover lots of different topics. Identity, of course, is central to how we think about and enter the conversations, but we talk about, relationships, speaking up, being heard, social awareness, understanding the stereotypes and the ways that they're seen and ways to respond and resist. And we do this through interactive activities. We use lots of different techniques to sort of help girls think about who they are and how they fit in society. We do videos and music, journaling. We also have what we call me work, which is instead of homework, they're like short little summary lessons from what we've talked about in the session that sort of are designed to help girls, reflect on some of the topics or things we've talked about. And we do affirmations, and part of this is also envisioned to give girls the kinds of tools they need to live healthy lives, right, beyond the program. Self-affirmations, journaling, these are things that we talk about as school skills and strategies that they can take with them beyond what we're doing in the program together. So I wanted to just quickly, there's a lot on this slide, but I wanted to kind of track a little bit of our journey. And between Gloria and I in creating Teen Tea, and getting to where we are right now. And I think it's just important to kind of see this journey because as I mentioned before, when we think about the structures that we're responding to, the systems of inequity and intentionality and injustice that's built into schools and society, the time that it takes to change those, the time that it takes to counter them and build something that's sustainable is long. And it's slow and it doesn't happen as quickly as we would like. So, you know, our partnership together has been a journey here. And the last few years, you know, the first 2 years were really spent building our partnership and relationship with each other, charting our goals and vision, and then getting into developing the curriculum. And then we've been piloting. We've done it in sort of different summer programs, community centers, libraries. But again, the vision was always to be in schools, which is where we are now. So this year, we're running Teen T in 2 schools, middle schools, serving Black girls. And so we kind of refer to this as the Two Cities project, and it's a pilot. You can see the project team here. I've got collaborators in St. Louis, as well as Cornell. And we've been working to roll out this program since August. So we're in our second cohort right now. And the goals of this project are still, I would say, very much in the pilot phase in many ways, but just to kind of get at that core question, can we create this kind of Black girl space within schools, within public middle schools that are serving, that have Black girls, to engage Black girls in this programming and building community, and to document the process, obviously, as part of the research. And so that includes the girls themselves who are participating in the program, getting their feedback, their engagement. We're doing surveys and interviews with girls, but we're also thinking about facilitators and caregivers as part of this learning process. So we also do interviews with our facilitators, our program facilitators, and the parents of participants. So that we can continue to sort of refine and learn like what's working and, you know, how young people are responding to this, and as well as parents and caregivers in signing their kids up for this sort of programming. So we only have a little bit of time, but I wanted to just share a little of where we are with our Chicago-based team, at least. And then I'll zoom back out to a little bit more about the program and maybe some so what questions for us. So here in our Chicago team is actually Evanston. So we're working with a middle school here in D65. Kenya Tuttle and Amanda Joy are the facilitators. They are both PhD students who work with me. Kenya is getting her PhD in theology, and Amanda in psychology. And so they run the program each week after school on site. And you can see sort of our collaboration here to get this program into the school and working in the school setting. So lots of support from D65 and my research team in Northwestern here, as well as the Northwestern Racial Equity Grant, who's been funding this, and then Distinctively Me, which is my partner's nonprofit. And so I want to give just a little update. We are very much in the middle of how this is going, which if you want to know how hard something is and how messy it is, ask how it's going right in the middle. So here we are, lots of challenges, but also opportunities. Some of them are related to these structures. Some of it is about, you know, school schedules and logistics, communication, approvals, getting Wi-Fi, right? Like these sorts of things of being in the space as a new partner with the schools. Has presented its challenges, but we have a good relationship, I think, with the school, and they've been accommodating as we sort of work through it. The recruitment and retention has been interesting as well. Part of it has been, you know, at least in the school we're at, one of the challenges we have faced is the after-school programming is sort of like bi-weekly and drop-in for the most part. Our program is every week, and you're here because we're doing something together every week, right? So some of it's been like communicating the norms and trying to fit a different model of after school programming within the school. But that has been a challenge, but I think on the whole, our first session, we had 5 girls who did the program after school in Evanston. Right now we have 16. So we definitely, word of mouth was good, and girls seem to like it. And so we have a much larger cohort this year, or this spring semester. But now we're on the other end of having 16 girls who are mostly 6th graders, who have so much energy. And so, restructuring our curriculums to engage with a much larger group compared to the fall. But there's so many incredible opportunities. So one is just this relational space. So it's been very fascinating to even just hear from the girls. Let's see, so now we've had a little over 20 girls who have gone through just in this particular middle school. And we've only had one girl who has ever had a Black girl space like this. Like this idea, this sort of doesn't exist. There isn't this kind of space accessible for the sample of girls. And so this idea of creating that relational space has been really valuable, and something that's attractive. Continuing to partner, this idea of it being very active and ongoing and renegotiated in time and space, partnering with school counselors and teachers, other after school programs, and really trying to navigate that space. We also have sort of thought about this, Brown's emergent strategy of small is good, small is all, and sort of grappling with, this massive change that has to occur and how you think about that happening at a small scale and centering those relationships and building community and learning with girls. And with schools. And so there's been a lot of value in the offering. It's not perfect. It's not flawless. It's not reaching thousands of girls at this point, but we do see the impact already. And we see that the influx of, girls sort of recognizing that this space is of value to them and something that they don't have elsewhere. And so there's great value in being able to offer that. Okay, so we have, we're, in the process right now of collecting data for this cohort for the schools. And these are just some quotes from our prior pilots of Black girls who've gone through the program. And we've been collecting feedback across the last 4 years about what girls learn, what they like, how it's landing for them. And I think it's very emblematic, and we've got, interviews and more data coming from girls, but they recognize as well the value. So the first quote is from a 6th grader who says, "I feel like this is a program about things Black girls go through. We talk about stereotypes and stuff, but it's not like so negative. Like they try to make it positive, and like we could talk to each other and we could bring our stories into it." And that very much summarizes the value of this space, that Black girls are centered, their experiences are elevated, they have time and space to share and dialogue about where and how they experience racism, hair discrimination, beauty standards, teacher expectations that they're loud, right? Like they can share those stories and hear a, me too, and let's talk about that. And that's something that's, as I said, relatable and engaging, and valuable for them in terms of how they're understanding themselves. Okay, so kind of going back to where I started, the recognition that schools, society more broadly, it was not built to serve, to care for, to value Black girls, and many other marginalized groups, right? And Black girls are aware of this. They're attentive to the school setting and space and how it matters. They can see when and how they're ignored or valued in school. And Team T is really meant to curate this sort of just and humane space for Black girls within systems that are not actually meant to serve them, with the idea that one could learn from such spaces to redesign and think differently about how our schools are built. And as I mentioned before, this idea that the value of the space is not in its perfection, but in the existence of it and the possibility that it offers, that it reminds girls and gives them space to see what's possible for them, and how we could be transforming differently. And so this question of, what can we learn about building just and humane schools from listening to Black girls about Black girl spaces is one that we're sitting with as a research team and as community partners and working in this project, which is, how do we learn from this, both to serve Black girls, but also to think differently and more broadly about schooling. And it's a question I hope we can discuss. And I just want to end with sort of thinking about how I've been conceptualizing this idea of just and humane spaces, such as Black Girl Space. One of those, what are some of the principles or ingredients? And one is that these spaces do center identity and recognize that identity matters, right? When girls feel seen, when they feel heard, when they feel valued, that their experiences are integral rather than marginal, that's a space in which you can thrive. Just and humane spaces really acknowledge the starting point, right? So again, it's not a neutral difference that we're contending with, but a systemic and intentional process of dehumanization and disconnection that's embedded in, ideologies of racism and sexism, right? So it's the sort of idea that colorblindness will not cut it. We need to be able to name the oppressive system so that we can challenge them. And again, really valuing the margins as a site of possibility, as opposed to just deprivation or oppression. And these spaces really prioritize some of our basic human needs, like curiosity, care, and connection. Being curious about ourselves and others, that's central to the work we're doing, caring for ourselves and each other, and feeling connected. And that those really are the antidotes to dehumanization and disconnection. Those are kind of power tools for moving us towards more equitable and humane spaces for young people and for ourselves. So thank you for listening. So much gratitude from me goes to my community partner, Gloria, and our collective work together over the past few years. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciate both the theoretical framing and the sort of real world application of it and how you're kind of putting those ideas into action. It's fascinating. I want to turn it now to our audience for questions. If folks want to raise their hand or put a question in the chat, I'm happy to read it. I'm also interested to hear if folks have examples from their own work of creating affinity spaces in their own school districts that they want to share. So any questions before I get into my questions? Okay. We have a question from Melody Knight. What type of resources are shared with the preteens and teens in their activities / reflection homework to connect with?
Yeah, so the curriculum is organized into 8 sort of core content sessions. So for example, when we do our session on beauty, we talk about beauty standards and colorism, hair discrimination. We sort of do like the history of the Miss America pageant and the, kind of provide some historical context and have them share their experiences. And then the me work that goes home is part summary of sort of like key points and things we talked about. And then we usually have 1 or 2 extension activities. And so that sort of handout serves both as like a tool for them to continue thinking, but also in theory email it as well, but it goes home. And so it serves as sort of a bridge between home and the program as well. And we sort of encourage caregivers as well to be able to follow up on what was discussed. But like for the beauty session, for example, I think the activity, the me work there is for them to write their own definition of beauty. What does beauty mean to you? So a lot of the activities are really centered on that sort of connection to self, as well as learning about, you know, the broader society. We have them, when we do emotions and empathy, we introduce the feelings wheel to them. We have conversation about, like, you know, not just being mad or sad, but what else is happening. And then we encourage them to try to use that, you know, when they are at home or in conversation with a friend. So it's really just sort of taking content and ideas and trying to get them to consider them beyond the space. It's not clear yet how much they're doing that per se. But again, in sort of bridging with caregivers and from our interviews with caregivers, that has been a helpful resource for parents to be able to follow up or ask questions as well.
Aripo.
Hi, everyone. I have a question, or really trying to get some understanding around how you work in schools, and like, do you have any, do you see any resistance, or kind of talk about the process of having programs that are just for Black girls in spaces that are not just Black girls? Like, you know, I'm thinking if, you know, going to a school and how it's presented in such a way that doesn't come across as this is not for you, this is for us. You know, I think that sometimes I see those kind of problems, and, you know, I always feel like it is the marginalized that have to feel apologetic around those spaces. And I would love to hear, you know, how you go into spaces and kind of present it to get the support of the schools.
Yes, it's a really great question, and one I should always try to make explicit. Like right now, we're just in 2 schools, and both of them have been very open and supportive. I can imagine many of schools that would turn it down very quickly, just for optics, right? Sort of the challenge of sort of navigating, especially in our current sociopolitical context. There would be schools and spaces where this sort of framing would be very challenging to be taken up. In our experience, we have not had the pushback of, you know, why Black girls. We have gotten questions about, what about Latinx girls? Do you have a version of this for other groups? We've not been asked about white girls. But so we've gotten that sort of angle on it. But we haven't gotten any, like, you know, that's not fair, or convince us, if you will, that Black girls need this. Instead, like, thinking about our conversations with school counselors, with parents, they're like, yes, please, thank you. And so I think it does highlight what we know about schools, that Black girls are having a particular kind of experience in schools, and whether, you know, anyone's calling it out or naming it as such, the idea of having a program that supports Black girls was taken up positively, and seen as a resource that would help their students and sort of bridge maybe where schools felt like they were not meeting those needs. I will say, so we did some recruitment at like curriculum night and parent teacher conferences. And those spaces, we had a few of the awkward interactions, right? Where a parent or someone comes up and they look and they're like, oh, and, you know, like, oh, sweetie, that's not for you. And then they just move on to another table. But even in that space, we didn't have anyone who was like negatively confronting us. So unfortunately, fortunately, but unfortunately, I don't have good and like advice or sort of storying to share with you about like how to navigate it. We have been very just explicit and clear about what it is, why, and who we serve. And thus far, it hasn't been confronted as a problem, which definitely reflects where we're at and who we're engaging with. But yeah, it's a really important question.
We have a couple questions.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Oh, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, Repo. We have a couple questions from our partner out in Oakland, Christina McLean, who is asking, do you want to go ahead, Christina?
Sure. Yeah, I dropped them in there so I wouldn't forget.
Thank you.
Oh, no problem. So I have a couple questions, and I guess the first one kind of segues into the question that was just asked about like how like any pushback from like schools about having an affinity group for Black girls. But what about schools or districts that have existing groups? Like, have you considered or would you consider partnering with schools that have something and then saying like, hey, here's an add-on or like another thing that you may not be thinking about necessarily?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so with Aripo and Digital Divas, we're actually trying to work out partnering with them next summer, or this summer and into the next school year. So they're doing work around digital literacy and STEM education with girls. And so then having Teen T as a curriculum option that Black girls would be informed about, and then that would exist alongside the curriculum. So we're definitely open to that and have tried to do that in some different ways. And I think that's where we've experienced some of the tension, right? If a program more broadly is for everyone or like a broader group, and then this comes in and is selective, then it's a little different because that's not the norm. But I think it is actually probably a very good model in schools or spaces where coming in with only a program for Black girls would be like, no way. But if it were like a subgroup within something that's existing, it might be taken up a bit easier. So I definitely see that as possible.
Thanks. And then my second question is like, how important is family involvement? So, you know, like depending on the school, the child's life, like their parents may just like go to school, or their parents are, you know, helicopter parents, and they're always right next to them. So, you know, how do you help either students or schools like mitigate that depending on level of parental involvement if it's really required?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we do not require it. They do have to sign them up and say, yes, they can do this. So they have to have it like we need some sign off in that way. What we do as part of the program is we do a kickoff session at the start. So it's a 10-week program. The first session is a kickoff session, which we do virtually, and that's for the caregiver and the kiddo. And that's where we at least have a touch point with most caregivers, where we are talking about the program, introducing ourselves, sharing a bit about the story, etc. So that I think has been helpful. We do not always get all parents though. And so there's varied engagement, and none of it's required. So if a parent signs you up and then they don't come to the kickoff, you don't get kicked out. Likewise, you know, at the end, when we do follow up with caregivers, we do interviews. If they don't want to do it, then they don't have to. And we send out the emails every week with like, here's what we did this week. Here's the me work that went home. Here's the topics. Here's what came up. And so one of the things we've learned through interviewing is that caregivers, which I have a 12-year-old. So I'm like, I get it. We get so many emails and there is so much coming at us, right? And so some of the parents that we interviewed were like, I love that it comes. Did I read it all the time? No, but I like knowing it's there and I appreciate the effort. And right, so there's parents who want to be engaged, but are also very busy. And so we have been thinking and talking about like ways to hold space for that, right? So we want it to be something that that Teen T offers for Black girls, but also as a bridge for caregivers and connection to school. And I don't think we've gotten there yet to really know like the best ways to do that. But we think it's important. to be able to connect with parents. One of the ways that we've been learning from caregivers is just about like why they sign their kid up, which is very insightful. And a lot of it is she never had this kind of space before. I know that these are important topics and I want her to have, you know, the knowledge and opportunity to discuss them. I want her to make more friends with other Black girls. I want her to love herself and feel confident in who she is. They're going into the teen years. Like parents are very attentive to, you know, what's happening around the world, and sort of tuned into what their kiddos need. So we have right now, I'll just say we have 2 parents who are very, very hard to get in touch with. And so we're still sort of troubleshooting. They've signed permission, but we haven't had much correspondence beyond that, but their kids keep showing up. So, you know, that's good. And we keep reaching out. But I think we definitely would need a better structure and network to catch some of those parents who have a harder time being engaged in these kind of more traditional ways. Thank you.
Onnie, are you good with one more question?
Yeah, of course.
So Sasha from CPS.
Hi, thank you so much for the great talk. I'll try to make it quick since I know we're almost out of time, but I relatedly maybe would love if you have any kind of more general takeaways for those of us thinking about curriculum development. I heard you mention so many great things about like opportunities to reflect on the self and make connections to the self, like family, community involvement. It sounds like a lot of really, really exciting, amazing work we should always be thinking about in curriculum development. So do you have any more general takeaways that we should be taking with us for this work, very important work specifically, and curriculum development more generally?
Yeah, thank you. Great questions. I mean, I think we're still like, you know, learning through the process, but I'll say a couple of things that come immediately to mind that maybe I didn't mention. One is sort of orienting the values or principles, right? So as we've been going through the curriculum and doing it at multiple points, training facilitators to run the curriculum, right? That you get these questions of like, how much time should we actually spend on this one? And if we skip that, is that okay? And if we, you know, and so it really forces you to be like, what is it about this that we really want them to know? And that's sort of, we've taken that vision sort of across the curriculum. And so it's like, you know, if they skipped X, would that be a problem? And so like kind of distilling like, what is the value? What are the core principles that you want to be communicated or transmitted through the curriculum? And that has been more of a priority, if you will, than the specific lesson or the specific activity, right? And getting our facilitators to understand the intention and like that core principle of a given lesson have been more effective, I think, in terms of like translating. So, you know, in terms of curriculum development, the activities are definitely important in the content, but there is also the more like subtle, like what are the core ideologies here or the core principles that you really want taken up or you want sort of highlighted. The other thing I would say is listening to the young people. And so one of our pilots, we used a youth advisory. So we had like 20 or so girls who went through a couple different cohorts, but they would do 3 sessions of the program. And then they would meet with someone who was not facilitating and they would give us feedback. What did you like? What didn't you like? And we did that for, you know, in 3 segments. So we kind of had that more close feedback and critique from them, which turned out to be really helpful. And the key lesson was we don't want to be talked to. We want to talk and we want to be able to do things and share things. So centering activity and engagement and relationship is key. They know a lot. Like we're not teaching Black girls much. They know it. We're helping them communicate it. We're giving them space to share. We're helping them process. And so sort of valuing what kids know and creating space for them to engage with you.
Well, Ani, thank you so much for joining us today. This was amazing, and I'm sure we could keep going with questions for another hour. But just want to give you a round of applause and thank you so much. Yeah,
All
and
right, thank
go ahead, Paul.
I was just gonna say thank you very much. It's really fantastic.
Oh, good. Thank you so much. Thanks for the invite. Nice to be on with you all. Feel free to reach out.